Hey everybody, and welcome to this chapter 4 overview where we talk about deciding what to teach, curriculum development. These are the learning objectives, which I am not going to read right now because we will talk about each of those as we get to that section. But first I want to start with, there's a couple of primary perspectives on what kind of types of curriculum to teach students on the autism spectrum. And your book talks in the beginning of this chapter about both of those primary perspectives, and then tells you that they're going to, in this book, focus more on a second philosophy, the second of the two philosophies. So the two philosophies are, and it goes over the history of this a little bit, but Browder and colleagues have really changed the way people thought about teaching individuals with more significant disabilities. And they argue that everyone should have access to the general education curriculum, a full educational opportunity, that we do not yet know what those students can learn, which is, in my opinion, very true, because they haven't, frankly, been given the attention, space, opportunity to learn any of it. And so when we decide to go a route where it's completely functional skills driven, we are not presuming competence, and we are essentially taking away a potential life path for them, which is a big deal. Another thing that they consider is that you don't have to have a prerequisite of functional skills before you can access an academic curriculum, that those can be learned in conjunction, and that there may be an advantage with a combination of academic and functional curriculum in terms of, full potential for the student. And now, just to share with you my bias, that is my particular perspective on working with individuals with disabilities. I come from that particular venue of, I think that we should promote inclusion, and we should promote an equal educational opportunity for all students, and that we stop thinking about, well, I can't do that because they don't have these supports available. And we need to flip that script to, well, schools and the community at large need to make sure that those supports are there. The other perspective that the book talks about, and that they then say they're going to go into as kind of their philosophy, is more that other side where we talk more about functional. Because this book also focuses on individuals with more significant disabilities. So on the lower end of that autism spectrum, I think that's really one of the reasons they choose to go in that direction with this text, whereas I'm guessing they consider the folks on the high end of the autism spectrum already having access to the general education environment just by the nature of their disability. So that's just the general perspective that the authors of this book are coming from. I'm not telling you that that is what you have to have. What I'm here to do is talk about both sides. And all the kind of in between. And that's actually what this graphic goes over. So there are, excuse me, risks and benefits from all the different curriculum choices. Well, excuse me, all of the curriculum choices that are focused on teaching something. I've been in a lot of classrooms where the focus has really been more on babysitting and has not been on teaching things. But if your focus is on teaching your students, which it better be, dang it, there are benefits to all of these different kind of versions of a curriculum focus. There are risks as well. So let's take a look at the far left side. If you exclusively teach a standard academic curriculum, the potential benefit of that, of course, is greater access to general education settings, and then therefore peers. Also, potentially much greater access to post-secondary education. So the thing with taking kids out of an academic curriculum, even for some of the time, is they lose that opportunity gain all the academic skills they would need to really be successful in college. So if that's a goal of the family and the student, then that's a deep consideration. However, if you focus exclusively on academic curriculum, you won't have room in a student's schedule to spend a lot of time on functional skills or even those social skills, and some of the soft skills that basically special education opportunities can provide. So that's kind of the pro and the con there. The other end in the blue on the right-hand side is exclusively teaching functional life and vocational skills curriculum. If you focus solely on that end, we do see the potential benefit of improved independent living skills and working in more adult integrated settings. The con to that is you really do have a lot less access to general education settings. So a lot less access to typical peers and missing out on that. It's especially if you're doing a lot of CBI, which is great. CBI is awesome, but it obviously the nature of CBI, although it takes them into the community, does take them away from their same age peers and experiencing school the way their peers do. And it reduces their potential access to post-school educational options. And then there's kind of the in-between, combining functional life skills curriculum and standard academic curriculum. And I tend to fall actually more in this green space. I'm a moderate person in general, but with kind of a leaning toward the to the yellow side. But the combination means that there's really not enough time in either area to fully achieve the goals that they might need to accomplish. And so they may continue to lag behind their peers academically because they're missing some of that academic time by coming out and doing the other things. At the same end, they may not have enough intensive time working on independent living skills, functional skills to be as independent as they can. I kind of disagree with some of the statements here in this graphic, I'll be honest. I think there's a way to approach academic curriculum with a functional intent the whole time. And that just really means connecting to real life function and purpose of any learning you're doing in an academic environment, which is something I teach my pre-service and in-service teachers anyways, that to really make something relevant. And something we talked about in Universal Design for Learning is making sure that what you're teaching is relevant to a student's life, that there's a real life connection, or definitely at least an interest in for the student in that content area. And just trying to really drive home, we often forget because we're so focused on reaching a standard. Why do they have to learn that standard in the first place? Why did a team of experts determine that this is an important skill for students to have? And helping students make that connection to the ultimate importance or reason that that standard was even developed as something that we should all achieve as part of our education. So big ideas, I know, sorry, and I'm probably rambling. But then that purple is the end I talked about initially. It's the group that doesn't really teach anything. And this, of course, is absolutely not what should be happening in any classroom. I don't care how severe or profound a student's disability is. This teaching is not a babysitting job. You should be teaching something all the time. So, because what happens is that then these individuals are relegated to lifelong dependency and supervision. And there are individuals who will have at least certain degrees of that, of course. But what we are trying to achieve here is quality of life for all of our students. And that involves giving them opportunities for choice, presuming competence in general, and really, really trying to set them up for the best life possible. So after that little soapbox rant, let's go into the focus on curricular areas. So our goal in this section is to list various curricular areas, that includes academic, vocational, and functional skills, and then discuss legal and practical constraints on choosing student targets in those areas. Public school system was established, really the purpose and ultimately why the standards were created the way they were, was to create a literate, well-informed, and self-sufficient citizenry. And currently, the focus of public schools is designed to get everybody set up and ready to go to college. That was not always the case. Um, of course, there used to be more of a track, two tracks, one the college track and the other the vocational or trade school track. And there were problems with that because people would be pigeonholed and they didn't want to be. So I think, well, with No Child Left Behind in Every Student Succeeds, the focus shifted really on that common core curriculum and everybody making a goal for college. I think the idea here again was a philosophical one of, if we prepare you for college and you decide to go to trade school, you haven't lost out on anything. I'm certain there are folks that will argue in other ways, but that's kind of where we are with the school system in general. And although we do have a plan for college, we all know that things like Common Core curriculum, Common Core standards were then taken by states and they either made their own version or they align them with Common Core standards. But either way, they're standardized. They're not based on individual student goals. We know this. Whereas we as special educators, and especially special educators of individuals with autism, we are also legally mandated to follow an individualized education program. So sometimes finding the balance is really tough because we're kind of being pulled in two directions here. And when we work with students with disabilities, that standardized curriculum may not be what they need to get to the post-school outcomes that they want. So that's where I tend to also kind of go in the middle of the road here, and nothing is hard and fast for each group. I just want to encourage you to consider that there will be long-term outcomes for what you help families choose. So choose wisely. Um, IDEA also mandates that when students hit that 14 age, that we start looking at planning transition plans and transition-based curriculum, and how are we preparing our students for future that's successful. And that too affects potentially access to that standardized curriculum, because what the team decides a student needs, they may not be able to get to if they're taking all of the typical classes that their peers are taking and so on. So it creates a challenge for all of us. But there are a lot of post-school outcomes for students with autism. And page 95 kind of goes through some of the basic areas of covering the range of what is, as we know, a very wide spectrum disorder. And they've broken it down to basically, and this aligns with transition planning, of course, educational outcomes, employment outcomes, and then independent living outcomes or options. So the focus of educational post high school, you're looking at possibly community colleges, four-year colleges and universities, and perhaps some vocational training. So post high school, if a student doesn't go straight into a job of some kind, they want further training. These are some different options. I think you all know about Eagle Academy, which is a program on the Georgia Southern Statesboro campus that I'm actually heavily involved in. I'm the executive director of that program. We serve students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we have several students in our program with autism who would not have been able to access college via the typical route. So these are kiddos who did take an alternate assessment, or they didn't pass with a standard high school diploma, would not have made it into Georgia Southern on their via the typical track. So they are allowed to come into the university via our program. They do not get a bachelor's degree. They do have access to courses where they could take them for credit, though, which is pretty cool. And that two-year program is really designed to help train them and prepare them for their career or job area of choice and build their independent living and self-determination skills. That's the focus of the program. So it's a transition program. We would consider that kind of a vocational training to some degree, but it's college experience. Or maybe they're going to college via the typical route. A lot of students with autism are attending college at higher and higher rates now. Although your book does talk about there is a discrepancy in disability categories in the percentage of students with autism who make it into college, and it's lower than other disabilities. I think that would not be the case necessarily compared to individuals with intellectual disabilities, but I think what we're talking about here is learning disabilities in general. Okay. Employment options include competitive integrated employment, which is like the dream, right? That's a standard job in a regular environment, and what we're working toward for all individuals. We also have day treatment programs where individuals that require more supervision and support may get some more pre-vocational training, some work on independent living skills, and perhaps even leisure time activities. Usually the goal for these types of programs, they are not really supposed to be forever. In fact, sheltered employment programs, which is what these used to be, have been outlawed. And so because they became a housing, just a unfortunately, they became something that people couldn't get out of. They weren't learning anything and they weren't progressing. So the goal of programs like this are typically to help students or individuals develop the skills they need to get at least some type of supported employment, which is that next thing there. They used to be sheltered workshops, but supported employment really means it's there are a lot of folks that they might work in an enclave or small group, or they have a specialized supervisor of some kind, but there is a level of segregation from a typical work environment or a typical job. So it's not generally the goal, but that is kind of what we're talking about there. And then military is often an option for some if they don't have certain medications they have to take, because that will preclude you from that, and they're able to pass the entrance exams and admission requirements otherwise. Living options, as you know, would run the gamut with parents, other family, maybe with some type of respite services. There are group homes out there in all communities. And in many cases, this is more appropriate than living at home with parents, because you're living with, same age peers potentially, but also with some supervision. Obviously, at those types of places, you really have to be careful and keep an eye on what's going on in those. Assisted living facilities, supervised apartments where maybe someone comes in to check on you. Or you have some type of roommate with or without disabilities that perhaps provides some supports. And then there are self-contained villages. So now we know that institutions are not a legal thing, and that is good because they turned out to be a terrible, terrible situation. But we do have small kind of enclave areas, dormitories or cottages where perhaps most of the residents have a disability. And so there are services within that setting to help support them and hopefully help support their access to some type of employment and so on. Generally speaking, we want to go for, and then of course you have your independent living in general, living in an apartment or a home and on their own, getting married, having kids, all those things. You want to look at what does the student want? And that's what we're going for here. Okay, what does the family want? And hopefully it's not those super segregated settings. Sorry, one sec. I'm having some technical difficulties here. It's important that you as a team decide what to teach before you decide how or where. So that means you're not deciding placement first. You're deciding what kind of curriculum does this student need to meet their goals? What would be most essential? And then you can look at, okay, how and where would they most likely get to that? So for example, I worked with um, I was a special education facilitator in a high school setting. So I was an LEA for bazillions of IEP meetings. And I would look at my teachers' IEPs before we got started. And I would look at the goals and just make sure everything was kind of in order before we really got into it. And frequently they would create a goal. Let's say their student had some significant reading deficits, like they were still decoding, like their testing showed that that was a major deficit area, so they created a goal on decoding. Well, that's fine. If you what you've said in present levels is as a deficit area, and the team decides that yes, this is a really important skill to work on, and then this student was in all like co-taught English, ELA, and was never pulled out for anything. Well, what ELA program do you know of in the gen ed environment in high school that's teaching decoding skills? They're not. So that doesn't match, right? So if we are determined that the student really needed to learn and focus on decoding, and that would be a question more of, is this an appropriate goal, or should we be focusing on his comprehension, which is definitely a grade level focus and something he'll get access to, and then help support his decoding skills by giving him AT access to Read Aloud. I mean, that might be where you want to go. So that's a team decision, obviously, what is more important, and the student should be center in all of that. But you need to figure out what it is you're going to teach, and then decide how or where are they going to get access to what they need to be taught. And so you need to know what each student needs to learn and let that knowledge direct your educational decisions. And again, you are not the only person that decides this. Your admin should not be the ones deciding this. What's available at my school should not actually be what decides this. In fact, IDEA says it cannot be. It's supposed to be based on what the student needs. So keep that in mind. I know you still have to work within, do what you can, but technically, the fact that a school doesn't offer something currently doesn't mean that that's a reason you can't put it in an IEP. So keep that in mind. Functional curriculum and academic curriculum should both be considered. One shouldn't necessarily automatically preclude the other. Our second objective is to list benefits and challenges of standard academic curricula and functional life skills curricula for students with autism, because we definitely want to consider both sides of that or some combination of the two. So first of all, as I emphasized earlier, your curriculum should be developed by a team, not any one person. And that team should really know the student, okay? IDEA mandates that IEPs be developed by a team. And that team approach can help, augment the different types of curriculum and what would be valid for each student or effective for each student. That's why we have a general education teacher as part of this, because they can tell you, well, this is what we're learning in the classroom for that content area or that goal area. And yes, we can definitely easily incorporate this goal into the general education classroom, or, that would present a great challenge. Yada, yada, yada. So that's why that team approach is really important. And then when there's agreement about what's to be taught, there should be little disagreement about how and where it should be taught. So if everybody agrees that the student needs to learn these certain things, then it shouldn't be too challenging to figure out where and how that will happen. And make sure, this as parents, but students need to also be involved in this process. It's their life. So that's really, really essential. Curriculum should definitely have a strong focus on post-school and adult goals. That's why we do transition planning, and we start as early as we can, and we make it very person-centered, because we're setting them up for a successful life and what they want to do. And they may not know what they want to do, but they may have a general idea, If they're saying, I want to go to college, or I want to live on my own, or, any of those things, these are kind of broader concepts, then there's certain pathways that you really need to make sure you're focusing on. And that's why we ask about, what types of employment goals do you have? What types of independent or living goals do you have? What types of um, learning goals do you have? What do you want to be able to do recreationally in your leisure time? Then you can choose your current curriculum targets related to that, right? So what are the short-term steps that can get us toward that big long-term goal, and what type of curriculum focus would be the best way to get them there? This slide says functional life skills curriculum is frequently the best choice. They're obviously focused more on that. I kind of actually disagree with that. So that I'm not going to say that's the best choice. I'm going to say that is definitely a choice left up to the team, and that you shouldn't discount academic opportunities. Curriculum is functional if it results in the student's ability to perform essential tasks independently. I do agree with that. We want our students to be as independent as possible. Curriculum should also be chronologically age appropriate. So the activities you use, the materials you use, the places that same age peers are, these should be the foci of your curriculum. Even if it's in a self-contained environment, we shouldn't be seeing, like when I started teaching high school in in a classroom with kids with moderate ID, the only materials that were in there were like first grade books and kindergarten books. That's not age appropriate. That might have been level appropriate to their reading abilities, but it certainly wasn't age appropriate activities or materials. So be on the lookout for that. Make sure you're focusing on that. And then make material and strategy modifications to meet the developmental needs of your students. You can take grade level curriculum and adapt it and modify it to fit the developmental needs, the academic level needs of your students, especially nowadays when we have so much access to more universally designed curriculum, um, things like unique learning systems, a lot of technology that can help us adapt and provide supports via like read aloud functions. There's no excuse really to be teaching high school kids using a first grade curriculum. And you should think about how that curriculum aligns over time. It should connect from one year to the next and should be obviously scaffolded to build students toward that long-term goal. And if you are working with individuals with more significant disabilities, keep in mind you're going to have to keep reviewing and repeating the things that you're learning and slowly building on them. And so you need to be keeping that flow, that goal, and connecting things from one point to the next. You may focus on teaching, very basic level of a certain skill and be planning to continue practicing that until they achieve a certain level of mastery. Well, that should be how you're doing it. All of your instruction must lead to the established short-term, intermediate, and long-term goals. So your short-term goals, those short-term objectives on your IEPs, that intermediate is the IEP goal itself, and then the long-term transition goal. Those should all be in alignment for sure. You want to make sure you connect skills and activities across content areas. That helps with generalization and transfer of information. It results in stronger, more efficient learning. Makes sense, right? Curriculum should be community referenced. So keep in mind the goal of teaching students to function independently as adults in their community. When you're focusing on the curriculum that's most appropriate and important for your student, be keeping that in mind. What do you need to prioritize to have the most access and the most independent functioning in the community at large? Also, keep in mind you need to consider what is a culturally appropriate and important to the family and the student, the types of environmental demands in those settings, the accessibility of those settings. Although I would say that if there isn't accessibility, that's something that you need to all be advocating for. And but also be thinking about what are the environments the student prefers. So a lot of the time when you're doing transition planning, you're doing vocational assessments that asks the student a lot about their preferences and interests. If your student really, really, really hates loud noises, then will probably his career goal or her career goal of choice would probably not be in a place that is super loud. So those kinds of things would be part of the consideration of all of it. You definitely want to emphasize communication and socialization, since those are the primary areas students with autism find the most challenging and can be the most significant barrier for them, especially when we think about workplace. They might have the skills to do the job, but they don't have those soft skills that will get them the job in the first place, or it doesn't work very well, or people aren't able to work very well with them in that setting, and so they are less likely to keep the job. That's historically speaking when it comes to individuals with autism. Um, does that need to be a consideration? And part of the reason I actually push for inclusion so much is honestly so that we create a community of folks who are used to all kinds of diverse folks from all walks of life. And so when we get into a workplace and you happen to have somebody with autism in your as your coworker, that it's not such a huge barrier for you. You just kind of you recognize it. You then have a level of understanding and ability to provide supports when you're working in that environment. However, the reality is that's not where we fully are. So if we want to set our students up for success, we want to help bridge that divide. And then you want to incorporate those skills in all curricular areas. So social skills and communication can be taught in every class, in every content area. That shouldn't be just, we only talk about this in this particular class setting. So that should be embedded throughout. All right. What is the curriculum development procedure? So our goal for this section is to state each step of the recommended curriculum development process and be able to briefly describe each one. Here we have the steps that the text lists for the process of curriculum development. First thing you need to do, because this is backwards planning, folks, you establish our long-term goals in living, working, recreating. So what are the long-term goals of the individual? The placement is not talking about where they're placed at school. It's talking about their living placement goals in the future. Based on that, you develop an activity or skill list in multiple domains to reach those goals. So you take the goal, then you start listing what are the skills they're going to need to access those environments. And therefore, or what are the activities they're going to need to do in that environment? This is an ecological inventory right here. What are they going to need to be able to do in that environment? What are the activities they're going to engage in? What are the skills that are part of that? Now you know what you need to teach, right? Then you can get a baseline for where they are in those skill set areas. And then you know, here's our gap, right? You figure out which amongst those are the most socially valid, meaning they will have the most functional, practical implication on their life and would involve like the most, what's the word I'm looking for? Most streamlined version, like the most efficient way to get at what you need and prioritize those targets. So you're looking at what are the skills they need to access these environments. Now let's rank them in order of importance And also be thinking about, are we going to, and based on where that student is, how big the gap is, um, how uh, how quickly, how efficiently can we get to as many of these as we can? And then you use that to write your annual goals and your short-term objectives, and then develop your IEP. So what happens a lot of times is we kind of go the other way. We start with our IEP and then we go the other way. That's absolutely not how it should be done. We need to be backwards planning, folks, because we need to be super efficient about this. We only have so much time with our students, and a lot to do, as you know. Target where those students should be functioning in the future. Look at those long-term goals, then think about intermediate goals, like what about 5 years from now? And then you think about backing it down to short-term goals. What about for this year? What about for the next few weeks? And that's how you get a lot outline of what you need to be focusing your attention on. Develop your curricular inventory essentially to reach those goals. This is where we get that very individualized focus, and where sometimes access to that typical academic environment sort of takes away from that really targeted focus toward the long-term goals. So, but once you have an idea of what you need to be working toward, then you can start doing your research. Start examining the published curricula, or see if you need to develop some type of new curricula to meet the needs of the student. And then an important part of all of this is completing an ecological inventory, which I touched a little bit on in this previous slide, but your text goes into a lot more details, and you will be completing an ecological inventory for this, excuse me, for this module. But basically, it means you go into those different environments and you observe. You look at, what are people doing here? What is the process that they go through? What are the different skills you need to actually have in order to do that? So let's say you're even just talking about, going to the grocery store, and you break it down in your brain, or what are the things I need to know to be able to do this? I need to know where to go in to go in appropriately. These days, I also need to know that I need to put my mask on, right? I need to know if I'm going to grab a shopping cart, or a buggy, as they say around here. I'm from the Southwest, so we just call them carts. But anyway, you need to know that you're grabbing that. You need to, how to find what you need in the store. You need to know about the money, and all the pieces surrounding that. You need to then know how to get in line at the checkout. You need to learn how to put your stuff from the cart if you go to a checkout with a person, onto the cart, onto the rolly treadmill thingy. You need to know how to pay for that. You need to know how to communicate with the checker, and potentially take change or whatever, answer any questions that might need to be answered, and then pack up your cart and exit. You still have things to do though, right? You still have to be able to, if you're driving a car, like, get it all back in your car and put the shopping cart away. And so there's a lot of different environments. And sometimes we have to, because we are so, like, the process might be so ingrained and familiar to us. You really need to kind of go in with a new set of fresh eyes, and you sit in that environment and you just look around and you watch and you see what people are doing, and you start thinking about your student, and would he or she be able to do that at this point? And what can they do, and what are they perhaps going to need some training on? And it's really important to break down the different skills and activities that exist in those settings, and figure out what are the key pieces to learn. It's huge, and it should really be driving a lot of that curriculum decision making. So when you do an ecological inventory, like you will be doing for this module, you have to first list all the environments in which the student must function now and in the future. That sounds like a lot, right? So you're going to focus on those end goals as much as you can, if you know them. If you are working with young students, this could be an opportunity to talk with the student or the family about, what do you want to do when you're done with high school? What do you want your child to be able to do when they're done with high school, even if that's many years from now? What are your dreams for this student? That gives you an idea of where to start. And then you can really think about what might need to be happening in each of those environments. Then you list the sub environments for each environment. So if there's a home, they want to live in a home, what are the sub environments for that? The different bedroom, the different rooms, the bathroom, the backyard, the front yard, whatever that might be. At school, you're thinking about the different classrooms, the cafeteria, the playground, potentially the hallway, the gym, all of that kind of thing. And you list those sub environments. And then within that sub environment, you think about the different activities that the student must conduct within that. So if you think about, we've broken down, let's say, the school into the different rooms, and you have the subcategory of cafeteria, then you would list the different activities and the skills needed to access that cafeteria. So things like an activity would be going through the food line or eating lunch, cleaning up after yourself, those basic procedures. What are the skills within each of those? So then you break it down even further. If you go through the food line, what are the skills you have to be able to do? In your text lists, kind of breaks it down for you. You find the tray, you get your plate and your utensils potentially, and you have to look at the environment they're in, because school cafeterias work differently in different places. So you look at the current environment. How does that process work at your school? And so what are the skills the student's going to need to be able to access that independent? And you want to be thinking independently. What's going to need to happen, or as independently as possible. And then you organize those activities and skills into areas or domains. For example, they talk about self-help domain. Could be the environment, might be the school, the sub-environment, the cafeteria, the activity, go through the food line, the skill, locate and obtain a tray. So obviously you're not going to be able to do an ecological inventory on every single aspect of this child's life for this project, but you're definitely going to want to hit the big ones. So we'll go into that a little bit more later, but that's an overview of the process. And your text shows you a lot about some things to ask, especially within those different environments. Table 4.6 has a lot of great questions to get you thinking about those different environments and what you need to look at when you're figuring out what would be, the skills and activities that are important there. Then you assess for current level of functioning. You have to take baseline data. Where is your student in those key activity areas, in those sub-environments? You could use some sample indicators from the curriculum to help you, or some type of assessment that matches a curriculum, like a pre-test. If you're looking more at like, how does the student navigate the cafeteria, that would be an observational recording that you'd want to do. So you might task analyze what happens in the cafeteria, and you kind of go down the list. You have the student try to do it, and you go down the list to see what can he or she do independently, and where do they struggle and need a lot of prompting. And that's what number 4 talks about, devising a checklist in which each behavior is coded by whether the student can do it with help, or cannot do it at all. And that is where a lot of task analysis will come into play and be really super important. And your text actually mentions the Brigance, which is a great, there's several Brigances, but the one that is the inventory of basic skills is the one you use after that early childhood phase. And it really does have a great set of skills across a multitude of domains that might help you with that baseline assessment. And then we talk about social validity. So the social validity talks about basically, is this skill really important to not only the child, but the family and other significant people? So let's say one of the things that I see happen a lot is this idea of a couple things: shoe tying and sorting coins. When you're getting to high school and your students still working on tying their shoes and sorting coins, you have to start thinking about, is this really a socially valid skill? Is it so important to learn how to do that? Can't we just get shoes that don't need to be tied for our individual at this point? Can we not focus more on next dollar up, or how to safely use a debit card of some kind, or even using Apple Pay or something? I mean, this day and age, we just don't do a lot of coin counting. Um, and is it really that essential to life? If their ultimate goal is to be a cashier of some kind, well, then yes, that would be a very socially valid skill. But if it isn't, then that's something to consider. So you want to think about that and make sure the family is with you and the students with you on that. All right, once you've gone through all those steps, then you prioritize those activities and skills and decide what you need to teach first. Most important for this year. You want to teach from simple to more complex skills and content. You want to teach skills that currently require the most assistance. You want to teach skills or activities that are used most often. So here is where we talk about functional communication being a major priority, because that affects and influences all aspects of a student's life. Same with social skills, and same with your general self-help skills. So toileting, dressing, that kind of thing, feeding. Those tend to be our priority because those things, A, they keep us alive, and B, they deeply influence all the different aspects of our lives. So those would be, kind of number one, and then you start filtering down from there. Organize what the student needs to learn into goals and objectives for the IEP. The ultimate goal for the student to achieve the ability to participate in school, home, work, and community as independently as possible. All right, so then you have goal statements and behavioral objectives, which I'm not going to go into right now. But here we have some samples that break that down for you. This is particularly for early childhood. A communication goal might be that Henry will label common objects. The objective for that is more specific here. Given the command, "What is this?" and the presentation of a shoe, sock, toy, spoon, Henry will say the correct label 10 out of 10 trials for 3 days. So we have the objectives are written in a really nice, specific, measurable way, which is how we should be writing those. Now, your annual goal could also look a lot like that. That's actually how I was taught to write annual goals, was more like these objectives are written. But either way, you should ultimately have something that's measurable and specific enough to collect data on. Okay. Here are some sample goals and objectives in elementary. I'm not going to go through each of these, but you will have access to the slides. So go ahead and read through those. They're nicely written, very clear. When you read that, when you pick it up and read it, you know exactly what it is that Mary needs to do. Here we have some goals and secondary levels, some vocational goals, some money goals. It's funny that they're talking about coins when I just said that, but again, this would be based on the individual and their personal goals. This one's talking about using the phone correctly. This is really old too, because it's talking about an unplugged phone. Like, who uses a landline anymore? I think that's funny because it's not an old, this isn't an old book, but that is kind of an old goal there. I wouldn't recommend that one. All right, then once you've done all of that fun work, you develop the IEP. And remember, again, we'll emphasize that should be a team effort. It should address students' current level of academic and social functioning needs, assessment issues, and then prescribed educational and related services. Of course, we want to have all of that in there. And then by age 16, and actually IDEA encourages at 14 on, that the IEP must contain some type of transition plan. And many of our students, especially in those in the autism spectrum, also have a behavior intervention plan, which I know you're working on in your group projects, but that's also a big part of the IEP. All right, let's talk about curricular refinement. And our objective here is to define each level of competency and identify behavioral objectives written at each level. So levels of competency. First of all, keep in mind objectives can be taught to mastery at each of 4 hierarchical stages, which your textbook lays out as acquisition, which it's really identifying a target behavior when someone else performs it correctly and can perform it himself with some degree of accuracy. It's really the lowest level of competency. So the text gives an example of the student providing exact correct bus fare 8 out of 10 times during 3 consecutive sessions. This would be at acquisition if maybe it takes him a long time to pick the correct coins, but he gets there. But then he can't necessarily ride the bus to work, right? So we got the part where he was able to pay the bus fare, but he's not able to actually go that next step. So that's kind of an acquisition level. It's those beginning stages of learning maybe a larger skill. Fluency is, as those of you who teach reading at all, or speech, refers to the rate of the performance of a behavior. So if it currently takes the student 5 minutes to find the correct change, he's not going to be able to ride the bus because there's no way the bus driver is going to wait that long. So we need to increase fluency, right? We need to speed that up so he can get on the bus in time. He's got to choose a correct bus fare within 20 seconds so that the bus doesn't leave without him. Maintenance means that the student can perform their response at an acceptable rate over, a couple of weeks or months. And they're able to maintain it over time, not just like 3 consecutive sessions, right? We check back in later and they're still able to do it. That's maintenance. And then generalization is when they take that particular target behavior and they're able to do it in a different environment than it was initially taught and demonstrated. So under different kinds of conditions. And that's ultimately what we need to be working toward, is that generalization, because they're not always going to be in your classroom. And to demonstrate the skill, they have to actually be ultimately in a different environment. So part of what you're considering when you're developing goals and figuring out what you're going to teach is what level of competency is your student at with that particular skill. And that's something you'll also be doing for the assignment this week as well. Once you kind of narrow down an area to do an ecological inventory on, or a skill area, that you're then going to assess what level of competency the student is at in that. And I actually talked about all of this. So I'm going to move on. And a huge part of when you're teaching a skill like this, especially if you want to go through those different hierarchies, is to create a task analysis of the skill, breaking it down into sub-skills or steps, or breaking the content into a sub-content is important. And then you list each step, the goal being that you want to make the steps more accessible to the student. You break it down to a degree that the student needs. So, you know, that's the interesting part of a task analysis. It can differ greatly from student to student. You may have a task analysis of washing hands, but for some students, you can kind of combine some of the steps, and for others, you may have to super break it down. So that is important. I as a high school teacher, I did create like file folders for each of my students, and we had several of them had very similar functional goals or vocational goals, self-help type goals that we would work on. So I'd create a similar task analysis data sheet. It might be tweaked a little bit depending on the needs of the individual student. And then I was able to just have those file folders with me. And when we were doing that task, and I could check off the steps along the way, you know, and what types of prompting they might have needed or what they completed independently. And each time we had a session. And so I could keep a long-term data collection on that task analysis. And so we could see progress and patterns of where students struggled. And that was just a nice, easy way to keep that all organized. Your text shows a nice task analysis breakdown on setting a table for dinner. So if you're not familiar with the task analysis process, this is a really great way to teach individuals with autism, especially when they really focus on those concrete, literal steps, logical steps. And you can create a task analysis that they can see, picture-based, word-based, and they can follow. So you don't necessarily have to always be teaching them each step. Eventually you could fade your support, and they're using that task analysis as a checklist to complete the task. All right, so each step of a task analysis should be listed in a specific observable way that you can measure. And so you can determine if a student has achieved mastery. And then make each step in such a way that it can become a prompt for the next step. If the step has the word "and" in it, you may have to consider whether that step needs to be broken down into two instead of having the "and." Pilot test the task analysis with a student before you really finalize it. So that's a huge thing, actually. Before you roll it out to the whole room, pick somebody to try it with and see what kind of tweaks you need to make. And inevitably, there will be some. All right, I've already rambled on way too long, but 4.5 is our last bit on this. So hang with me. If you get tired, just pause and come back to the video. But our learning objective for 4.5 is to discuss the benefits of various curricular formats. There are definitely many different ways to compile and format curricula. You can have goals with accompanying objectives. You can have lists. You can have some type of matrix. You can have skill or activity displayed as a task analysis. But really, it depends on what it is that they're working on and what the specific focus is for that particular skill. So this is where I always struggle with that initial decision of how to lay out the plan. Essentially, that's what this is talking about here. The format of curricula is, what is our plan to get to those goals? So your text lays it out in a variety of different ways, because there's different ways to do it. It's like deciding how to write a table. There's different ways you can go about it, and they're not necessarily wrong, and they may make more sense to some people than others. But your text in figure 4.3, they arrange a curriculum with the first column having domains. Like, for example, they have interpersonal relationships, grooming, and then receptive language skills. Those are the different domains they list. The next column is a goal. So they have one goal related to each of those domains. And then the third column is objectives. And within that, they have 3 objectives for each goal. So you could break it down kind of that way, showing that little hierarchy there. Another one shows a curriculum arranged by domain and skills. Another figure, figure 4.5, shows a curriculum that's actually aligned by the objectives kind of being that primary, that far left, then then a bunch of activities for each objective in the next column, and then the third column is the materials that are needed for each of those. And finally, there's one that's arranged by domain, objective, activity, and environment. So it also talks about like, where are you going to work on this skill? So like I said, there's lots of ways to do it. There's one that also, I like this one too. It talks about the curriculum's arranged by the goal, the objective, the person, and the evaluation technique. When, where, how are you going to take data on that? So that's important. So you have to take a look at these and figure out, what will work for you and your classroom and keeping you sane. And sometimes it seems like a lot of work to set this up initially, but ultimately it saves you work in the end because it makes sure that you're following this kind of, you're following the plan, first of all, and you're not getting distracted and derailed. And also it's a lot easier to show other people what you're doing. And this is good because you could send home to families and they could see how they can perhaps work on skills in a similar way in the home setting. And also they have a stronger idea of what it is you're working on, which as a parent, I always find really helpful. I don't like being in the dark about all of that. And then there can be curriculum that's arranged by level of learning, which was the last one they show there. And that's where we go into, or at the acquisition level, fluency, application, and so on. So to summarize, developing an effective curriculum for students with autism is especially important because of the large number of deficits that many students have. So we do have to be very targeted about this curriculum design. IEP teens and teachers need to choose goals and objectives from transition skills, social and communication skills, functional life skills, vocational content and skills, and standard academic skills, especially when you're working with those who have more significant challenges in a variety of domains. You should be considering all of these areas for all of your students, but you'll probably have a lot more to cover for students with more significant disabilities. And realize and understand that what is not taught may affect post-school outcomes more than what is. So be very conscious of that. And that's why it's really important to do that backwards planning and make sure the team is all on the same page here, because you're probably not going to be able to teach everything. That's just kind of the plain and simple truth. So there's just not a lot of time, especially when students need to be taught and retaught, and it just takes them longer to learn. And so we're going to run out of time. At some point, they do age out. Everything taught should address post-school goals and be chronologically age appropriate and connect back to the community and their access to it, and refined so that students progress at an acceptable rate. We want to keep those high expectations going. These decisions are vitally important. So take the time. It seems like a lot. You have to do it anyway, essentially, when you're creating the IEP. These might feel like extra steps, like there's no way I'm going to think through all of those things. But ultimately, like I said, you might front load a lot of time and energy at the beginning, but ultimately that's going to get you to the end goal so much more effectively than if you don't do this. If you don't teach what students need to learn in a way that ensures mastery, then decisions about placement and instructional methods really do not matter. So keep that in mind as well. If you haven't set up the appropriate supports and the systematic instruction that your students need, then it doesn't matter what you choose as your curriculum. It's not going to get to the end game that you want. All right, y'all, I know this was a lot, but this is a pretty important chapter. And so again, if you've read it before, read it again because there is a lot to dig into here. Thank you for listening. I know this ran long, but I appreciate you and take care.